Oke, I think sudah online ya Mas dari YouTube ya. Bentar. We still waiting for an indicator of YouTube live streaming to get ready on, and I think it's being sent to YouTube.
Okay, the
Okay.
live streaming is set, so you
Okay.
can start the meetings.
Okay, before we start the meeting, I will give this meeting to Interfadia as the moderator for tonight. So glad to see you, Anna. And yeah, we can do a lot of discussion later after your explanation about the feminism. So please, welcome.
So should I start now? May I? Okay. Hello everyone. Good evening in Yogyakarta and good afternoon in Athens maybe, or yeah. Okay. I'm Intan and tonight I'll be moderating our discussion. Before we start, let me apologize in advance that my English still work in progress. So please excuse me if I make a mistake, but I'll do my best. So our theme tonight is why feminism matters toward a more just epistemic world. We'll explore how feminism connects with epistemic justice, whose voices are heard, whose knowledge counts, especially in the global south, like Mas Odi said before. First of all, thanks for everyone for coming tonight, and we are honored to have Dr. Anna Karastasis. She is a political philosopher and leader of Resist Project. She is an author of Intersectionality, Origins, Contestations, Horizons, and co-editor of Transfeminist International. Her current work connects intersectionality and abolitionist traditions, looking at struggles against borders, prisons, racial capitalism, and permanent war. She also co-founded the Feminist Autonomous Center for Research in Athens, and in 2025, she received the Emma Goldman Award. So, without further ado, Dr. Karastasis, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Intan. As I said, I'm really grateful for the invitation to discuss with all of you questions around feminism and epistemic justice. And I'd like to express my appreciation to Anga and Intan and Rodi and everyone at Ruangan Filsafat, as well as LSF Odyssey, who've organized today's discussion. And since epistemic justice is about how knowledge is created, how it circulates, and what effects it has, the interlocutionary and intersubjective relations of any discussion of epistemic justice should consider questions of power in how that discussion takes place, and not merely the contents or the what of that discussion. So with this in mind, I'd like, with your permission, to keep my lecture to a minimum and allow ample time for all of us to exchange our ideas and questions, ideally in an atmosphere that empowers all of us to speak and to listen. And as always, I think a successful philosophical discussion, if we can speak about success at all in relation to philosophy, is one in which we leave with more and better questions than with which we came into the discussion. And by no means do I position myself as an expert in this discussion, nor as someone who has the answers, let alone all the answers. That kind of hierarchy and closure, to my mind, is quite antithetical to philosophy as a way of life. If at any point I'm speaking too quickly, or you can't understand what I'm saying, or you want me to back up, please just pop in and I'm happy to clarify anything as we go. I want to start with a provocation, and that is that a more just epistemic world is in our reach. By this, I mean that we are already reaching toward and struggling for a more just epistemic world, as the subtitle of today's event puts it. Some of us actually are dying for such a world. People may not use the words epistemic justice or understand their struggles as epistemic struggles. They may not frame them in terms of knowledge at all. But as Rosalba Icaza and Rolando Vasquez remind us, all social struggles are epistemic struggles. Feminism, as a transformative knowledge project, has exposed how epistemic injustice is both a cause and an effect of cis heteropatriarchy, reducing women and trans people of all genders at best to unreliable knowers, at worst to mere matter, incapable of thought and therefore of self-determination. Anti-colonial movements and post-colonial theory have emphasized the importance of decolonizing the mind, to cite the title of a landmark book by the late Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o. A more just epistemic world is in our reach because the space between our ears and the space between our bodies are spaces that we can shape according to the political commitments that we want to see realized in the world. They are spaces, our minds, our bodies, and our relationships, they are spaces where prefiguration of worlds that we want to bring into being, just worlds, is uniquely possible. Conversely, our minds and our hearts and our intersubjective relations are spaces that are subject to acute epistemic violence and spaces that state power and capital seek to control. And here we might think about historical prohibitions on enslaved people learning to read, or today, barring girls and women from receiving formal education. We can think about the ways that in national academies, we encounter state control over public universities alongside privatization, and the ways in which in education systems, national narratives are privileged in curricula, in what is taught, rather than socialized, given collective self-determination. We can think also, and we need to think most urgently, of the scholasticide in Gaza that forms part of the genocide of Palestinians, in the disappearance of genocides of Africans in Sudan and Congo from international political consciousness and political agendas, in the re-entrenchment of gender apartheid in Afghanistan after decades of war and occupation, ostensibly to end it in the name of women's liberation. So a more just epistemic world is in our reach because we're already connected in ways we don't readily acknowledge. And currently, these are most often exploitative, violent relations of extraction, even if the individuals involved in them seem indirectly involved and the shape of these relationships seems unintended. To think about this interconnection, we might consider how interwoven in unequal ways, knowledge production and consumption in neoliberal universities in the imperial core and extractive industries in its periphery are. So for instance, debates about AI, artificial intelligence in these academic spaces rarely addresses the exploitation and traumatization of workers who train AI in AI sweatshops in Kenya, or workers in essay mills in Nigeria whose creativity, knowledge, and skill go unrecognized as they are paid for ghostwriting essays to be handed in by UK university students in England, who are increasingly treated as consumers of a highly commodified product, education, rather than minds and hearts engaged in scholarly activity. Epistemic injustice is often seen as being twofold, as being hermeneutical that is, as involving interpretation, and as being testimonial, that is, as involving speech or declaration. So testimonial injustice is seen to occur when a speaker is discredited due to oppression. That is, they're not viewed as a person who can be trusted and believed, or who has authority and knowledge to speak on a particular subject, or indeed to speak on any subject. Hermeneutical injustice is seen to arise when social experiences are distorted because the concepts at our disposal invert or occlude, they hide social realities, kind of like creating an upside down world. So people who face oppression can neither make sense of their social experiences nor communicate them to others. These two concepts, I think, help us see how epistemic struggles are social struggles. And the philosopher Christy Dodson's work in this area, particularly her concept of testimonial smothering as a practice of coerced silencing, shows also the agencies at work in epistemic injustice. That is, that it's not sort of a phenomenon just happening or arising out of nowhere, but that involves the agency of knowers in an interlocutionary field, in a field of exchange of words, ideas, and concepts. And here, I think, as an example of this, of the epistemically undermined position of surviving sexualized and gendered violence, and how this is institutionalized, how this undermining is institutionalized. So inversions of victims and perpetrators and victim blaming discourses that we encounter, not only in interpersonal violence and in institutional responses to that violence, but also in macroscopic geopolitical situations. So last year, we had the pleasure of having Dana Aduna as a visiting scholar at the Feminist Autonomous Center here in Athens, whose work on survivors' senses of justice in Philippine universities illuminates those dynamics of epistemic injustice, of testimonial smothering, of testimonial and hermeneutical forms of injustice. Sarah Ahmed's work on complaint and the institutionalized management of sexualized violence in UK and European universities is another place where we encounter many fruitful ways of thinking through testimonial smothering. And testimonial smothering is also a key facet of racism, in particular anti-Palestinian racism and repression of liberation struggle and solidarity movements with Palestine. I was very much intrigued by the concept note that the organizer sent me in advance of our meeting today, in which they write that, quote, contemporary feminism stands at a crossroads, facing multifaceted challenges, both internally and externally. And indeed, I'm really interested in thinking through how those crossroads involve questions of epistemic justice and epistemic injustice. They go on to say that addressing these challenges requires a nuanced understanding of intersectionality, a firm commitment to inclusivity, and a strategic response to neoliberal and neoconservative influences. And I was struck by the language of crossroads because I've often thought about intersectionality being at a crossroads. My work on intersectionality the past years has traced how intersectional feminism, which is a fraught and contested sort of assemblage of knowledges, finds itself currently at a crossroads. After having been gentrified, mainstreamed, whitened, institutionalized, and constructed as a kind of sign of political completion, urgent questions arise, particularly in this moment of increased violence globally, about who has or should have care and stewardship of intersectionality and other concepts, of course, in feminist political thought, and how instead we might approach intersectionality as a community of praxis rather than a battlefield, a contested territory, property, or commodity. A more just epistemic world is indeed within our reach, where reaching, though, is understood as an activity that's distributed amongst agents in ethical political relation to each other, rather than an arrival or a telos, or the completion of that project. And with this, I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, and your worries about feminism, epistemic justice, and indeed why you think feminism matters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that inspiring presentation. Maybe we can discuss in Zoom. You have that question about feminism, yeah, right? Maybe sometimes feminism wait. I'm sorry. Wait. It's okay. Epistemic world, you said.
Yeah,
Mm,
I'm more. Oh, sorry, Dan. Please go ahead. Epistemic
yes,
world,
yes,
yeah,
you
more
can,
just
you can
epistemic
continue,
world. No,
please.
please go ahead.
Oh, maybe, yeah, epistemic having to do with knowledge, and yeah, world also the space are totally we're talking about, but uh, maybe I'm thinking about how can uh especially lecture that in university that have uh how can their voices can be heard while they're uh talking about epistemic world. Sometimes feminists can be misunderstood by others because uh yeah, maybe uh hmm maybe that's uh I'm not really thinking about how can feminists can be misunderstood by people while lecture in university that have not the voices like the there can sometimes we cannot we cannot uh yeah, maybe you can you can continue, and I'm sorry. uh
No worries at all, Intan. I mean, I think you've hit the nail right on the head there. You're absolutely correct in saying that feminism can be misunderstood,
yeah.
and indeed, is misunderstood, misrepresented. Um, I think that goes right to the point of the question of epistemic injustice,
Mm,
because a lot of the misrepresentations of feminism have to do with, first, discrediting it as an intellectual and political project, right? And secondly, silencing the voices of people who seek, for instance, gender equality, right? Making them seem, you know, extremist or just unfathomable, like things we can't even think or imagine. So this kind of misunderstanding, I think, it's a challenge in trying to engage people in what is actually in the best versions of it anyway, because there are lots of different kinds of feminism. Not all of them, in very serious disagreement with each other, and from my point of view, not all of them defensible. But it's a question of how people can enter into discussions and bring forth ideas when that ground for communication and mutual understanding is not there. And it's not there because of the very unequal, epistemic standing that people have, particularly when they avow due to oppression, and even more so, particularly when they avow views that are not endorsed by sort of the cultural hegemony or the dominant forces in society, let's say. And feminism addresses this, seeks to, in fact, redress the injustice, both epistemic and material, right? Because epistemic injustice, is like interlinked with a range of injustices that have material force in our lives. So the question is then how can we begin to answer a question like why feminism matters when we perhaps have misunderstandings of what feminism is that prevent us from engaging it as an intellectual or a political project?
Maybe I have something, some question. One question maybe for you. Whose knowledge gets imported into our campus, epistemic work first, local lectures, or big name Western journals? Uh, how lectures can be uh, sounding their voices about feminism that sometimes misunderstanding by a lot of people. How and whose knowledge gets imported? What do you think? Yeah.
I confess my ignorance first, and I would love to hear more and learn more from all of you about how you see the situation in Indonesian universities. I've never had the privilege of visiting Indonesia or engaging in universities there. I can only really speak to my experiences having lived and worked in universities, lived in countries and worked in universities in North America and in Greece, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Europe, about the dynamics of importation and exportation also, and the very unequal relationships amongst knowers who are located in, let's say, the imperial core countries, centers of capital, where universities are generally subject to like neoliberalization, are very often private or privatized. In some cases where they are state institutions, they are nevertheless held to a kind of profit model, right? So they function a little bit like corporations. And in those contexts, which, you know, if we're thinking about North America or Western Europe, for instance, in those contexts, we're talking about highly unequal societies that are stratified by class, race, gender. And in the case of North America, we're talking about white settler societies. So societies that have been formed through processes of colonization and enslavement. And so the role that university plays in those contexts is, in a sense, to reproduce those social formations as you know, deeply classed and racialized and gendered social formations. At the same time, though, there have been sort of transformative knowledge projects, of which feminist studies is one, Black studies is another, LGBTQI studies, queer studies is still a third. And the ways in which those knowledge projects have tried to counter the mainstream of what's taught in universities and in schools in those countries has created openings and spaces for students and research and also sort of, you know, spaces for connections with political and social movements in those countries, and is also the target over the past, you know, 40 years or so, the target of waves of repression and undermining, as we are seeing now, for instance, in the United States, with, you know, an agenda to undo the critical knowledge projects of gender theory and critical race theory. So I say that because there's and I encounter that in Greece a lot, which has a very different situation in terms of universities and sort of knowledge production. There's often a kind of assumption that anything that travels here from the United States or from Western Europe sort of bears the mark of imperial power. But actually, I think that a lot of the knowledge that has traveled is knowledge that is created in a kind of undercommons, is knowledge that is created in the context of social movements seeking to transform those social realities. Having said that, probably most of the knowledge that gets imported into peripheral, in many quotation marks, peripheral universities, such as in Greece, does indeed bear the mark of that imperial power. And in fact, is used in a kind of twofold way to discipline what is considered knowledge in the context of what's produced locally, and to displace it. So the issue becomes just a question of translating what texts are, you know, written and produced elsewhere and imported here. I mean, in the context of Greece, there's another complication, to this already very complex picture, which is that due to Hellenism, which is a kind of discourse on ancient Greece produced by Western Europe, Greece is constructed, well, ancient Greece is constructed as a kind of, cradle of especially philosophical knowledge, right? Or even the origin of various things, as problematic as these origin stories obviously are. Because of course there's not one single origin to knowledge, much less one located in in a singular, in what is seen as a singular location, which was in fact very much itself a crossroads at that time in the ancient times. That discourse of Hellenism, on the one hand, creates a place for Greece in thinking about knowledge internationally. But on the other hand, because it's constructed as the heritage of Western Europe, it actually forms a further displacement of people in Greece who are viewed as actually not the proper holders of that knowledge. Not that I'm advocating that they are, because in my view, all knowledges are for all of us to hold, for all of us to contest, for all of us to learn from, and no one's property at all, and not at all sort of the national inheritance of any, modern nation state. So when we're talking about, importation of knowledge, I suppose the question is, can we create different ways of sharing knowledge that escape the sort of the commodity circuits of that are constructed by contemporary capitalism, or are we sort of stuck with a situation in which whose knowledge matters gets determined entirely from above and from elsewhere? Let me stop there because I see a number of questions arising or comments that people want to make.
Oh yeah. Maybe before that, maybe that you said that it depends. Like it depends that where the knowledge are created. Is that like that? Yeah.
I mean, I think the positionality of knowers does matter. How we are positioned in social hierarchies matters to the kinds of knowledges that we produce. Not in a totally deterministic way, not at all. But we do have perspectives on the world, right, that are different based on the experiences that we've had, on the ways that others, treat us. So that's one level that I think the where of the knowledge being produced matters. The where of the knowledge obviously matters as well in terms of the sort of the sociocultural and historical legacies of knowledges that are not the same everywhere in the world, quite obviously. Now I'm just stating the obvious here. Sorry about that. But the ways in which we can also bridge and understand the different inheritances of location, I think are also really crucially important,
Okay, thank you. Maybe there's someone who raised hand, Mbak Diva, maybe can unmute your mic. So yeah.
Udah kedengeran suara saya? Mohon izin.
Sudah, Mbak.
Okay.
Silakan.
Okay, wait a minute. Sorry, Anna, for disturbing you. Okay. Talking
Not at all.
about okay. Oke, mohon izin ya Mbak, Mas Angga sama Mbak Intan. Ini cuman pop up aja tadi. Aku mau bilang ke Mas Angga dan Mbak Intan dulu. Tadi pop up aja di apa namanya di otakku. Sekilas ngomongin talking about your perspective, maybe Anna. I wanna tell what's my opinion, maybe personally think that the root of both the problems and the solution within feminism actually lies in humanity itself, right? Please correct me if I'm wrong about feminism, and I'm a newbie of the feminism it is. Regardless of the different streams of feminism, the basic idea remains the same because um, if if every person has a sense of humanity, at least willingness to respect one another, then inequality or discrimination will, I think, no longer exist. Am I right? That's how I see it in in Indonesia basically. And what I would like to ask you, maybe maybe Anna, is whether you also see that feminism in Indonesia is quite different from the one in the West or in America and others, maybe France and else. For my perspective in Indonesia, as far as I observe, the main issue today, right now, are more about inequality within household. Am I right? Mas Angga sama Mbak Intan, tolong koreksi aku kalau misalkan pandangan aku tentang feminisme di Indonesia itu salah. Anak, I think especially for those in lower social classes, while in other aspect like politics, the right to work and public participation or education, the situation is, I think, is already getting better, more better than 90s. I think, please correct me if I'm wrong. Meanwhile, how about is the West? I just want to know, how has feminism actually developed over there? What are the areas that have improved? And what issue are still have a struggle today in America, in France, also that have a radical feminism, right? As long as I know, Indonesian or Asia have a blood of feminism. It's feels like multiculturalism feminism, right? That have a different blood than Western, whatever it is, America, France, and else. So that's my question for you, Anna. It's all about perspective. I have my perspective, and you have perspective gitu. Maybe that's my question. So I think you can give me the answer. The issue of the Western of the feminism over there. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Mas Angga sama Mbak Intan.
Sama-sama, Mbak. Would you like to respond, Anna? Please.
Sure. Yes, of course. Thank you, Diva. It's a really large question. So I'll do my best. And again, I can only speak to sort of, again, from my perspective, as you quite rightly pointed out, in terms of what are the issues that are still present for feminisms in the West, and also in terms of what areas have improved and what issues sort of still exist despite those improvements. it sounds like, similarly to Indonesia, certain things in countries in Europe and in the Americas have been addressed, such as questions of political participation, of sort of basic rights to bodily self-determination, reproductive rights, questions of labor market participation, so kinds of work that is open to women, for example, that historically was only open to men, and so on and so forth. But having said all that, I think that what we're seeing right now with the growth of anti-gender movements and mobilizations around the world, and the ways in which reactionary and authoritarian forms of rule and the politics and kind of cultural forces advocating those are instilling themselves, establishing themselves in many places in the world, including in North America and in Europe, but also in Asia, in parts of Africa, in parts of South America, and so on. We can't necessarily assume that the improvements that we've seen historically as a result of feminist and anti-racist struggles are not going to be, taken back, clawed back. And we see a deliberate politics undermining those historical social and political gains, undermining gender equality, undermining reproductive and sexual freedom, undermining even women's labor market participation in various areas. So it's interesting to sort of think about this phrase that the philosopher Angela Davis has made also the title of one of her relatively recent books, which is that freedom is a constant struggle. And this is a notion that she takes from Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist fighter during slavery times, during times of enslavement in the United States. And she kind of adapts this to our present historical moment in trying to say that, this is my own reading, so everyone should have their own reading. But I think it refers to two things. First, that things that you might think have been won, struggles that might seem to have been won, like, for example, even things that might seem sort of common sense nowadays, can always be reverted back to a previous state of affairs where they were not common sense at all. And that brings us back to the question of epistemic justice. What is common sense in a particular moment in time, right? So, for example, we might be shocked to hear that, up until relatively recently, in countries that today claim to have achieved gender equality, sexual assault was permitted within perfectly legal within marriage. That might be actually an affront to our common sense today. But the point of freedom being a constant struggle reminds us first that what is common sense today hasn't always been so, and we are not safe necessarily in thinking that it will also be so tomorrow or the next day or 10 years from now. So struggles are ongoing. And the second sense in which I think this notion of freedom as a constant struggle is really important to us as feminists is that nowhere in the world, none of us, of course, with vast inequalities characterizing our world, but still nowhere in the world, the vast majority of us will experience lives free of oppression and exploitation of any kind, right? And certainly, if we take seriously the idea that none of us is free, while some of us are not free, then literally none of us can experience, oppression-free life in our lifetimes. That doesn't mean, though, if we take seriously the notion of freedom as a constant struggle, that we can't experience a kind of freedom. And that's the freedom of struggle. And it was what I was trying to say before, in terms of the space between our ears, our minds, and our hearts, and our relationships to each other. These are thoroughly constructed by oppression, thoroughly constructed by inequality. But we can emancipate ourselves. We can emancipate our minds. We can emancipate ourselves. We can decide, what kind of people we want to be in the world and how we want to treat other people. And so freedom is a constant struggle, in the sense that we might not experience, the liberation as an event, or the revolution, the feminist revolution as an event where all oppression for everyone is ended, but we can experience a kind of freedom by thinking freely, by acting freely. I know that might not be a quite satisfying response to the specific and quite broad question. Not broad, the question was very specific, but the answer would need to be very broad in terms of sort of the main issues in European society or in North American societies around feminism. They are myriad. And I think it's really important to insist that there is no one society in which gender oppression has been resolved. And in my opinion, it's quite problematic to hierarchize, to put in a hierarchy, the West as having achieved some kind of emancipation of women, for instance, or of LGBTQI people, whereas other places in the world, and particularly in the global South, that has not been achieved. I think that's a false representation. It's a misrepresentation. There are differences, of course, in how forms of oppression are experienced and resisted in different parts of the world. But the conditions in different parts of the world, the gendered conditions in different parts of the world, are very much interconnected at the same time. So if we look at the oppression of women in Afghanistan right now, which was handed over to the Taliban after the retreat of occupation forces that were there ostensibly in the name of those women, 20 years prior, we can see exactly how interwoven our social realities are, and responsibility for those social realities. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that, so we can keep talking. But I just, the question is an important one, and a crucial one to ask each other, to try to understand each other's lived experiences and realities, right?
So Mbak Diva would like to add, or maybe I just let Mas Odi to talk.
Okay, can I ask questions? Yeah, I have a question, Anna. I'm currently interested in how the feminist movement in Indonesia uh, grounded their movement on certain particular morality grounded. Yeah, for example, that we know, everyone knows that Indonesia face a lot of post-coloniality in terms of to expand or to run the movements in feminist itself. Yeah, but I will start my questions by asking the foundational ethics on doing a certain kind of feminist movement, especially in global south that overwhelmed by the post-coloniality circumstances and so on. What kind of morality foundations do you prefer to propose, Anna, regarding we know that in Indonesia we have so many kind of particular identity, particular community, and also we know that the women from Japanese is a bit different. It's a bit different, yeah, in their lived experience with when we compare them to Sasaknese, for example, or Balinese, yeah, or Papuanese women, and so on. How can we can make sure that the movements can cover all kind of intercultural dialogue or intercultural encountering between different kind of background. For example, how Papuanese women understand themselves and how Japanese women understand themselves. Can we compose one formulation, for example, or the common ground for the morality to position all kind of identity justly, yeah, and make sure there can be treated uh, justly and epistemically, including testimonial justice and also hermeneutical justice. Thank you. I hope you got my point. Thank you.
Yes, I think I've understood. But let me know if it seems I haven't in my response. Roddy, thank you so much. I think again, I confess complete ignorance in terms of the specific contextual situation in Indonesia and the feminist movement there. I mean, this in itself is a function of epistemic injustice that I am ignorant about this reality. What I would say in response to your question is that in terms of a kind of ethical political grounding for feminist movements, and something that I think around the world, feminist movements have become alert to, and this is in a sense captured in the concept of intersectionality, is that feminists need to be as concerned by the relations among women, if we take women to be sort of the subject of feminism, and that's another big debate that we can get into. But in any case, if we think of women as the subject of feminism, the collective subject of feminism, that feminists need to be as concerned about relations among women as they are about relations between women and men, let's say, in a cis heteropatriarchal system. And that's important to the extent that all of these different lived experiences, but also inequalities between groups of women that you were mentioning, Roddy, if I understood you correctly, need to be addressed. And these differences and inequalities have to do with class, they have to do with cultural dominance, they have to do with faith and religion, particularly in multicultural contexts where not all faiths are given the same recognition. They have to do with disability, with sexuality, with a range of axes, lines of oppression and privilege that are about the heterogeneity, the differences within women. And so, I think intersectionality captures that in trying to understand, as a concept that emerges from Black feminist thought, trying to understand the intersection between race and gender in particular in constituting differences amongst women, but also in making politically and ethically imperative feminist anti-racism. So you can think of it this way, I think, or one can think of it this way, in that if, and again, that's a premise that we can discuss, if women are sort of the collective subject of feminism, and that subject is cross-cut by a range of political identities, positionalities, and relations of power, then all of those are of interest and urgency for feminism to examine and struggle to transform. So I think that would be one way that I would sort of off the top of my head respond to the question of, the ethics of feminist movements in the global South, by emphasizing the need for intersectional awareness of the relations of power amongst women, and therefore sort of the plural political agenda that feminism needs to have if it's going to be struggling for all women's emancipation, all people's emancipation indeed, but let's go with the premise of women for the moment.
Okay, thank you for your response. I totally agree with the way you propose intersectional dialogue, intersectional communication between each group of feminist movement or the women movement in Indonesia. Because if you Google, the terms of state promoted discriminations to the women in Indonesia, you will find good books, titled State of Ibuism, that we know how the state sponsors of the inequality in positioning women in Indonesia, has a very, 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 very strong impact by the previous regime, the New Order regime, under Suharto's authoritarian government, that they domesticating women only as the partner of their husbands. We have Bayangkari, for example, when Angga, for example, as a police, so his wife have to be involved in Dharma Watinta, just to fulfill the needs of their husbands, being good for their husband and so on. And the impact is we have rarely political representative in our representative office, that come from women, because they are being silenced by the power of the previous regime. I think that is the addition for me. Maybe next we can consider how the struggling of the women movement in Indonesia, especially in Global South. Thank you very much, Anna.
Okay. There is so much questions in column chat, and there is so much, some raised hands. But before that, Mbak Diva want to add something to respond. Wait.
Wait, let me searching for Diva name so I can unmute the
Okay.
Diva.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
Okay.
ya sudah.
Okay.
Gak kedengeran
Go
ya?
ahead. Go
Oke,
ahead, Mbak Diva.
sorry Mas Angga dan Mbak Intan. Hello Anna, I just want to respond your explanation. Totally, I am agree with you. If you know that why I ask you like that, it's because in Indonesia right now, I noticed that many people tend to use radical feminism, right? Which I think is actually quite risky considering our cultural values from my perspective. That's why I feel a bit worried, but then again, it really depends on each person's personality, right? And of course, I don't have the right to control how others to see that things. This is just I'm sharing my thoughts, Anna. Thank you for your explanation, and at least now I've gained a broader perspective on this issue. Thank you, Anna, for your explanation, and thank you, matur suwun, Mas Angga sama Mbak Intan.
Thank you, Mbak Diva. Maybe I can read the questions in column chat, Anna. How does the feminism concept of testimonial smothering contribute to the broader theory of epistemic injustice, specifically in limiting the scope and uptake of marginalized individuals' knowledge and experiences within established social and institutional context? This question is from Chris. Maybe you can respond that questions. Thank you.
Sure, I can try. So I drew the concept of a testimonial smothering. It's been elaborated by the Black feminist philosopher Christy Dodson. I can send you the reference to the text. It's an article that she published in Hypatia Journal, I want to say in the early 2010s. I forget the exact date at the moment. For me, how it resonates and how it contributes to the broader theory of epistemic injustice. Well, first of all, smothering is an action, right? It's an action of actively preventing a person from speaking or breathing, even. So the act of smothering, for me, makes very manifest the concept used in this concept of smothering, makes very manifest, makes it very clear then when we're talking about epistemic injustice, we're not just talking about a reality that has some kind of sort of metaphysical status outside of human agents and human societies. Because in the concept, there is an act which requires a body, which is sort of enacted on another body. It's a metaphor in a sense, but it's not only a metaphor, because a lot of the ways in which epistemic injustice, I think, socially is reproduced involves also forms of physical violence, of which smothering is obviously a violent act, right? It also helps us see that it's something that is being done to a particular speaker or a particular group of people. And that it's not something that arises from that knower's ability or inability inherent to themselves to offer compelling or convincing testimony. So one of the aspects of epistemic injustice that it illuminates, I think, testimonial smothering, is that the inability of people to speak and be heard is not located in them, but is something that's imposed on them from the outside. and not only from these anonymous social structures of oppression, but also by individual agents who are empowered socially to quash their testimony. So I think that's what sort of inspires me about the concept. But you'll really have to read Christy's article, Christy Dotson's article, and come up with your own view about it. And I'm happy to, I'll make a note of it, and I'm happy to send the article on, the reference on to the organizers to circulate it to anyone who might be interested in reading it. It's really a very interesting treatment of epistemic injustice, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you, Anna, for your perspective, and you can share sometimes maybe. And this is Muhammad Ilham Reshan. You can unmute if you want to talk about feminism with Anna. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. Is my sound clear enough? Hello.
Iya ya, aman Mas, suaranya aman. Cuman agak bergema sedikit. Suaranya agak bergema dikit. Nah, cuman masih termute ini suaranya, masih belum unmute ya. Bentar, saya coba unmute lagi, bisa?
Oh ya sudah.
Oke.
Bentar saya ganti ininya. Kayaknya
agak gema dikit aja gitu.
Okay. Wait. Hello? Aduh.
Getting better.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Saying before that, before I ask my question, I think it's just not like a question. It's just like a clarify. I would just want to clarify. Before I ask, I would like to give some appreciation to Anna. Thank you so much for your explanation, nice explanation. Okay, and here saying that about the intersectionality, intersectionality as a method. Yeah, that before that you say before that, and I read in your article, yeah, you describe intersectionality as a professional concept. Yeah, isn't right? Yeah, I think you have to correct me if I have misunderstood it. I found that that's really interesting. Yeah, because it seems to keep the concept open and flexible, but at the same time, it made me wonder about how solid it can be as a methodology. Yeah, so I'd like to ask, when you describe it as a professional method, yeah, is that mainly to keep it before from the becoming dogmatic, or do you also see it as a pointing to some limits? Yeah, in it use as a fully established feminist research method. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I think, yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it so much in terms of dogmatism, but I do think that is another sense in which restoring intersectionality to its provisionality might be useful to prevent a kind of dogmatism setting in and a closure of questioning. In terms of the limitations that a concept that's provisional might have as a methodology, it's very interesting, this question. When I wrote that, and I have to travel back to the early 2010s in time, When I wrote that, what I was observing, and not just me, I mean, I was part of discussions with other people interested in intersectionality who were saying very similar things. What we were observing at the time was a kind of fast and loose use of the concept, which attributed to it a lot of ontological stability, and in particular, attributed to the categories that were sort of cross-cutting or intersecting in a lot of accounts, attributed to those categories of race, gender, sexuality, class, a lot of ontological stability. Whereas by going back and reading the work, particularly of Kimberly Crenshaw, but also other Black feminist thinkers who articulate the concept and other concepts related to it, one of the things that I was struck by was the persistent desire to question the boundaries of those categories of race, class, gender, and also the relationships that have been seen to exist between them. So it's not me who calls intersectionality provisional, it's Crenshaw herself in one of her essays, in a footnote of one of her essays in 1991, I think is the one in which it's said that intersectionality is being proposed there, not as some new totalizing theory of identity and oppression, but rather as a provisional concept that is taking up categories that are seen as inadequate, categories of race, gender, that are seen as inadequate precisely because they aren't intersected, right? They are these unitary categories that have in a way grown up alongside each other, are theorized and are used as sort of struggle concepts, mobilized around in ways that often bring them into analogy, but they aren't sufficiently intersected. And so she's using the notion of provisionality there to say that I'm going with these categories for the time being, for now, because they have material force in the world. We still need to understand how they're functioning, but we always need to look at them together. We always need to have them intersected. And the notion of dogmatism, I think, is really interesting in general in thinking about concepts and methods. And to what extent do we need solidity in sort of in methodological terms? This is also a really interesting point that you're making, Mohammed. So, you know, I mean, I'm trained as a philosopher, but in more recent years, I've also engaged in a lot of social research, which involves, you know, speaking to people, not just reading things they write. And there it's quite interesting that sometimes I find myself, you know, using words in order to communicate that I'm not sure if I had chosen a different word, if I would have gotten, you know, a different answer, let's say, if I'm in an interview asking a question, for instance, you know what I mean? And how careful and at the same time, how little control we have over meaning, how careful we need to be with meaning and how little control we have over it. There are lots of really interesting treatments of intersectionality as a methodology, and the ways in which we should bring categories into, for instance, designing interview questions in order to get at intersectionality in people's experiences, in many quotation marks. And yeah, I don't know, for me, it's a very interesting and open question around the question of, yeah, intersectionality and whether its provisionality makes it a weak methodology or not. I'm inclined to say that its provisionality is a strength, personally. But I know that not everyone is going to be satisfied with that, you know, because some people also want to look at things in a more kind of empiricist way, or in a more positivistic way, even. Personally, I'm inclined to think that intersectionality leads to a critical conception of categories that we're using for now in order to understand each other, but that ultimately aims at the dissolution and abolition of those categories. I don't know if that responds to what you had in mind, Mohammed, there with asking this beautiful question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. It's clear enough for me.
Okay, thank you, Muhammad Ilham. Maybe I want to ask you something, Anna. Kind of curious, but which thinker most changed your footnotes or the way you cite and write? I'm kind of interested about that. Maybe you can answer that.
Wow, what a beautiful question. I don't know if there's just one, but thank you for pointing out my obsession with footnotes. It's true. We encounter beautiful and evocative and provocative openings in footnotes often, and we often don't read them, right? Because they're like in tiny little fonts on the bottom of pages or in the backs of books often. But I think that they're really important, actually. They reflect something about the way we think and write. Of course, different disciplines have, you know, different conventions around footnotes and all of that, but we don't need to get into all of that. But I've been very inspired by Audre Lorde in my lifetime. And actually this summer I just reread a book, Zami, A New Spelling of My Name, which is her hold on, it's right here. Let me grab it. I have it right here. Biomythography, right? Which contains and is structured and inspired by her actual life, but also creates a lot of kind of mythological or fictional fabulations in it, and mythographic rather, not mythological, excuse me. And I had read this book in 2005, I want to say, like 20 years ago, friends. And I reread it this summer, and I was really struck by how much of her thought and her way of expressing that thought has affected me over the years. And at the same time, I mean, just after I finished this one, I read the biography of Audre Lorde that has been written and published by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, which is called Survival is a Promise, which is an incredible book. It's a beautiful book that I would suggest anyone interested in feminism and anti-racism and global justice engage with. Yeah, so I guess I might say Audre Lorde, but again, there have been so many. I feel like I've been affected really deeply by so many people that I've read, and reading has always been very important to me to open my world to open my perspective, to open my mind. So yeah, thank you for this really touching question, Intan.
Thank you for sharing your maybe last call to short question only. Drew Pirate, you can unmute your mic. Drew, do you want to talk, or maybe I just read the question?
Sudah di-unmute? Already unmute the microphone, Drew? You can ask
Oh
your
yeah,
questions. Go ahead, Drew.
it's gone.
Okay, wait. Okay, Drew, I already unmute your mic, but your voices, I can hear your voices, Drew. Is there something problem with your mic?
Maybe I read the question from column chat. So, uh, how does psychology and feminist epistemology connected to one another, and what are the impacts a country ever implements such things like that, such as changes to such laws and etc. Maybe that's the question, Anna. Yeah, you can respond it.
I mean, I can try. It's a pity that Drew Piero can't unmute their mic. So we would better understand the question. No, no. It's. I see now you've put in the chat. Not sure how to word it properly. No worries. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure I can really speak to it. The first part of the question about the relationship between psychology and feminist epistemology. I'm not sure that I'm able really to speak to that. But in terms of impacts, implementing changes to laws and things like this, I tried to sort of suggest a little bit earlier that we can't see legislative change as something permanent. So even if it's positive change, we need to remain vigilant. I'm not sure if vigilant is the right word, alert, awake and aware. And also that there's always a kind of gap between what is written in law and what is people's lived experience and what is lived reality. Like, so for example, there can be laws, prohibiting discrimination, and then a society can be marked by rampant inequality, as I think is the case globally. And there's a lot of also really interesting sort of feminist and queer critique of the notion of law as a guarantor of equality that we can sort of think about. At the same time, I have to say that there are also felt impacts when positive legislative change occurs. I know I've experienced those in my own lifetime in places that I've lived. And then there are also negative kind of repercussions of those positive impacts. Like, for example, a particular group can gain a kind of social visibility by being recognized in law and expose it through that social visibility to greater violence than they may have previously experienced not being recognized in law. Anyway, that's my take based on my sense of what you may be asking here, Drew, but hopefully you'll correct your mic and join us also with your voice.
Okay, maybe Drew cannot join us. There is interesting question from Muhammad Ilham. Want to talk with Anna, or I just read it from column chat? Okay.
Hello? Okay, I'm sorry, Anna. I just realized one more thing. Yeah. Previously, I've looked at Catherine and Nawal Sadawi, critics on polygamy, which they see a form of oppression from the perspective of best. We mentioned about before that the perspective of intersectionality. Also, we read their critics mainly as products of their own subjectivity and context, or can they be placed within a broader intersectional analysis? And how can and if so, how can we avoid making such critics like a sound universal sound? Yeah, given the different ways polygamy is experienced in diverse contexts. I think that's all.
Very interesting question, Mohammed. You point to two scholars who have also very different sort of experiential relationship to the, let's say, philosophical questions they're addressing, right? So Nawal El-Sadawi, coming from a cultural context where polygamy is practiced versus Catherine McKinnon, not. So that informs also, I think, the ways in which these, let's say, critiques or condemnations of polygamy are articulated in their respective thought. McKinnon certainly aims at universality, does she not? I mean, her whole theory of gender oppression, it has often been described as a closed system that can capture sort of that attempts to capture all aspects of it in essentially an equation. And so it's a kind of closed and totalizing approach to thinking of the problem. I mean, I'm thinking about her, early work, which, in the late 80s and early 90s, advanced a view of oppression as totalizing of women's lives, and particularly sexuality. So it's a question, to pose around this. It's a critique to advance in terms of her own intentions, her own philosophical intentions. I think the question of situatedness and transcending standpoint to aspire to universality, because I think that is the spirit in which she's writing. I could be wrong, of course, but it seems that way to me. El-Sadawi, I think, has a different approach, and is speaking in a more grounded and situated way from, as I mentioned before, a lived experience of at least a cultural context in which polygamy is a deep structure. I guess to answer the question about avoiding turning critiques into universal claims that overlook context is again, I'm going to state the obvious, is to think about context and to have to have accounts of that context and their lived experiences from as many sources as we possibly can, right? So to have an open and live debate in which this question can emerge and can be seen from a range of perspectives. I think one way in which feminist epistemologists have defined objectivity that's particularly useful is as broad intersubjective agreement. Intersubjective agreement, of course, can't just silence disagreement. So how does it synthesize a difference? How does objectivity, if we understand it as intersubjective agreement, synthesize disagreement, synthesize dissent, synthesize difference? Those would be sort of two quick responses to this question that I would offer in this particular moment.
Okay, so that's enough. Okay. It looks like we're out of time before Anna gives her closing statement. Maybe one final question from Mas Angga can wrap things up for us. Yeah,
Hello,
you can.
yeah.
Yeah.
Is there my voice? Can hear so clearly? Okay. Okay, kayaknya aman ya. So, hello Anna, and good to see you here. And yeah, a lot of discussion we talking about lately. But from the epistemic justice about the feminism as general, more specifically like intersectionality, and about the footnote example. But I observed some phenomenon in Indonesia, and also from my perspective too. But I think this is some sort of general question, and I just want to reconfirmation to you and with your perspective to answer this question. But in an and culturally fragmented society today, the movement that close themselves off from the criticism can lose their reflective potential and instead create like echo chamber. And here in context of feminism, it will risk no longer being a liberation movement, but rather reproducing new epistemic exclusivity, in my view, and only recognizing the knowledge that certain group, I think, like deemed feminist enough, maybe. But maybe this general question is just look like: is it possible that feminism itself falls to epistemic injustice when it closes itself up from the criticism? I just want to know from your perspective. And yeah, it's lately I observe in Indonesia, like, I'm the one who knew feminism just like that. So like any social justice warrior, so on and so on. But yeah, I just want to know from your perspective, Anna.
Thank you so much, Anga. Yeah, it's a really crucial question to ask, I think. Is it possible that feminism itself is enacting forms of epistemic injustice? I think we see this happening throughout the histories of feminism around the world, and these epistemic injustices often have to do with what Linda Martin Alcoff has called the problem of speaking for others. That is, feminism's rather the arrogation of the right to represent other women, that women with relative privilege along lines of class, race, and other axes, location also, are evinced in doing in a range of different contexts. And indeed, this epistemic exclusivity that you spoke about, and the sort of the range, rather the risk of feminism and any discourse becoming a sort of insular echo chamber, and the fear that by sort of insulating itself from critique, it actually is going to be, reproducing these harms, I think is one that we need to be very much alive to. And again, like earlier, we were talking a little bit about dogmatism. And I think it's quite important that we don't lapse into dogmatism in conceptualizing emancipatory philosophies as well, right? One always has to be thinking about what is left out, what is the excess, what is excluded. And indeed, if we're talking about epistemic justice, who, what knowers, what experiences, what social groups, what parts of the world, and so on. I think it's, yeah, just to answer, like, mindful of the time, we could have a whole discussion on the exclusions and epistemic violences of feminism and other projects that claim emancipation for the people that, you know, they claim to be mobilizing. And so, just to be a bit more concise and in the interest of time, I would say that yes, there is definitely this danger, and not only danger, we have seen it historically a lot. If intersectionality guards against something, I would say it is, and again, this comes back to what we were discussing in light of Mohammed's question around sort of epistemic closure and solidity as methodological strengths versus weaknesses. If intersectionality offers one thing that is positive in terms of an ethical political stance and a methodological approach, it is the understanding of partiality, you know, a situated partial perspective. It is the understanding that we can't grasp the totality of social reality. No one can. No one theory can. We need to be open to perspectives that are not our own and social realities that we have not experienced, or if we have experienced them, we don't view them in the same ways that others who have experienced them on the sharp edge of oppression and violence have. And the need to ask the other question as an intersectional method. So this is from Mari Matsuda's work. A method, intersectionality is a method of asking the other question. If I believe that, you know, gender is affecting a particular sort of political condition, I ask, well, how is race and racism implicated in this? If I believe that race is implicated, then I ask, well, how is homophobia and transphobia implicated in this? If I see a situation as, you know, thoroughly structured by class, then I ask about gender, and so on and so forth. You know, I don't need to keep illustrating. I think you understand what I'm trying to say. So this asking the other question, this provisionality, this humility, actually, with respect to the limits of one's own knowledge and one's own situated perspective, I think these might help us guard against the problem that you point out in terms of, yeah, generating a new form of epistemic exclusion, or worse still, you know, imposing a particular epistemology that sort of eradicates other points of view entirely.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. And I think that's a comprehensive answer. And yeah, I would like say apa say thank you to Ana.
Okay, maybe that's enough for questions for tonight discussions. Anna, would you like to share a few closing thoughts to wrap us up? Maybe some thoughts, maybe?
Well, thank you so much. I'm really curious to know why you all think feminism matters, or does it, in making our world more epistemically just. And I'm really curious to hear from you and to learn about yeah, basically every question that you've asked me, I'd love to turn back to you and say, well, what do you think about that? I wonder how you view this the question of epistemic injustice, how you experience it, if you do, how you view the relationship of feminism to the problems that arise in our lives. But maybe this requires another meeting somewhere down the line when you have time and energy for it, if you like. Because I'm really curious to know how you're organizing yourselves in these philosophical communities, and what drives your passion for philosophy and perhaps for feminism. So thank you so much for today's encounter, and I wish you all the best in all your pursuits, and I hope to meet again and see each other again. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Maybe to answer your question, I'm not saying this too much, but I'm also concerned about feminism movements. Yeah, but I'm not that kind of can translating my perspective because my limited speaking. Maybe we can do the next time, and then we need to wrap up. Thank you so much for your sharing thoughts, for your insights, and thank you everyone for your participation. Even though my English is not perfect, but I'm so grateful to moderate this session and learn with all of you. So have a good night. Thank you, Dr. Anna.
Thank you, Dr. Ana. But before we close, I just want to recommendation to you, Anna. Maybe if you want to know more comprehensively about the feminist movement in Indonesia, you can also searching on the Instagram or Google like Jurnal Perempuan. Yeah, there's a lot of feminist movement, feminist thinker that like engage to the recently issue on the women or the another minority in Indonesia, like Jurnal Perempuan and Konde. There's a such a website. Maybe I can arrange it from the email so you can do some little research so we can coming up to next discussions maybe.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
That would be amazing. Thank you. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Rana, and I really appreciate it. So let me to close the room for tonight. Okay, see you and have a nice day.
Thank you, Anna. See you.
See you. Bye. Take care.